The courtroom was filled with silence. Everyone was waiting: cameras, journalists, and security officers. Then suddenly, the door opened. Mazi Nnamdi Kanu walked in, calm but firm. He looked different this time: no long legal team beside him, no whispering lawyers adjusting his papers. Just him, standing tall, holding a few documents in his hands. When the judge looked up and asked, "Where is your legal counsel, Mr. Kanu?" he replied clearly, "My lord, I have discharged them. I'll act as my own lawyer for now." The entire courtroom froze for a few seconds. Even the judge looked surprised. Reporters glanced at each other, whispering. The courtroom air changed instantly. You could feel that something unusual was about to happen. For months, everyone had talked about confusion in his legal team, disagreements, delays, and endless back-and-forth arguments between his lawyers and the prosecution. But nobody expected this. Not the press, not the people following the case online, not even the court officials who had become used to the routine drama around his trials. There was a short silence before the judge spoke again. "Mr. Kanu, are you saying you no longer wish to be represented by your legal team?" He nodded slowly and said, "Yes, my lord. I have decided to represent myself. I know my case more than anyone else. I have been in this from the beginning, and I will not allow confusion or delay anymore." His voice was firm, yet calm. There was no anger, just determination. Every sentence he spoke carried weight, like someone who had thought deeply before making his decision. You could hear the quiet murmurs from the back of the courtroom. Some people whispered, "He really said it." Others shook their heads in disbelief. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked directly at him. "You do understand the risks of representing yourself, Mr. Kanu?" "Yes, my lord," he answered. "But I have been through risks far greater than this. I will speak for myself." It was at that moment that everyone realized this was not going to be an ordinary session. For years, people had known Nnamdi Kanu as a man who never shied away from standing by his words, but to take over his own defense in such a serious case was a move that shocked even his critics. Some of the court officials exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of it. The prosecution team whispered among themselves, quietly smiling as if they believed this would weaken his position. But those who knew him well understood what this meant, that he had reached a point where he wanted full control of his story. When he sat down, he began arranging his papers carefully. He did not rush. He seemed fully prepared, flipping through notes he must have written by hand. A few observers in the court gallery watched closely, trying to read his face. There was no trace of fear. He looked calm, focused, almost too calm for someone in his position. Outside the courtroom, word spread quickly that he had fired his entire legal team. Journalists started typing fast on their devices, sending out live updates to waiting followers. Within minutes, the news hit social media. People began reacting, sharing their opinions. Some praised his courage, others doubted his move. But inside that courtroom, he stayed focused, not moved by any noise from outside. When the judge called the court to order again, all attention returned to him. He looked straight ahead, waiting patiently. The prosecutor stood up to introduce the day's proceedings, but every eye was still on Kanu. Something about his silence carried more power than any statement made that morning. The judge turned to him again and asked, "Are you ready to proceed, Mr. Kanu?" He nodded and said simply, "Yes, my lord." That short reply carried 1,000 meanings. It wasn't just about readiness to face trial. It sounded like someone declaring that no matter what came next, he was ready to face it alone. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed. Everyone sat straighter. The journalists stopped typing. The judge herself paused before continuing. It was clear that from that moment onward, things were not going to be the same. This was no longer just another court session. This was a man deciding to speak for himself, to fight for himself, and to take charge of his own destiny. The silence in that room was deep. Even those who disagreed with him had to admit, it took rare courage to do what he just did. And as he sat quietly with his papers in front of him, waiting for the next step, everyone in that courtroom knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, history was about to record it. When the judge gave him permission to speak, Nnamdi Kanu stood up slowly, adjusted his papers, and began. His voice was steady, Not angry, just calm and powerful. You could tell he had prepared for this moment, not in a rush, not out of pride, but from deep conviction. He said, "My lord, I have decided to speak for myself because no one can tell my story better than I can. I have been patient, I have respected this court, but I will no longer allow confusion around my case." The courtroom went silent again. Even those who had seen him many times in the dock could sense something different. He was not reading from any prepared script. He was speaking from his heart, every word measured, every pause intentional. He began by recalling the earlier rulings in his case, one by one. He reminded the court of how he had been granted bail in the past, how that bail was violated, and how he was later brought back to Nigeria under circumstances still being debated across the world. He said he was not here to argue politics, but to remind the court that truth cannot be silenced by time or fear. Then he did something unexpected. He picked up a copy of the Nigerian Constitution from his table and started reading sections related to fair hearing, justice, and the rights of a citizen to defend himself. His voice was calm but strong enough to fill the room. The words came out clearly, without hesitation. The judge listened quietly. The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but the judge lifted her hand slightly and said, "Let him continue." At that moment, you could feel the shift in the room. It was as if the entire court, for the first time in a long while, was forced to truly listen, not to a politician, not to a defendant, but to a man fighting to be heard in his own way. He went further to question why, after years of legal proceedings, no clear verdict had been reached. He said, "My lord, justice delayed is justice denied. I have watched my case move in circles, but today, I am here to bring clarity. I want this court to hear me directly, not through the voice of anyone else." The courtroom remained quiet, except for the sound of his papers turning softly as he moved from one point to another. It was not just what he said that drew attention, it was how he said it. He sounded more like a trained legal mind than a defendant. Every word was balanced, respectful to the court, yet firm. Every sentence carried the weight of someone who understood what was at stake. Some people at the back of the room began nodding quietly, impressed by how he handled himself. Even one of the junior lawyers in the prosecution team leaned over to another and whispered, "He sounds like he's done this before." Kanu didn't raise his voice or try to sound dramatic. He stayed composed, showing no sign of fear or frustration. His confidence was clear, his focus sharp. When he spoke about the laws, he quoted not just Nigerian cases but even foreign ones, referencing decisions from other courts that upheld the right of citizens to fair hearing. It surprised many who didn't expect him to have studied legal documents so deeply. The judge took notes quietly. It was obvious she did not expect this level of argument from someone standing alone, without a lawyer by his side. After several minutes, the prosecutor finally stood and said, "My lord, this is becoming a speech, not a defense." But before the judge could respond, Kanu calmly turned toward the prosecutor and said, "It may sound like a speech to you because truth always sounds strange to those who are not used to hearing it." That single line changed the mood again. People sitting in the public gallery looked up instantly. Even the journalists began typing faster. The judge cleared her throat gently, reminding everyone to maintain order. But the message was already delivered. Kanu continued, speaking for nearly 30 minutes without looking tired or distracted. He spoke with clarity, with composure, and with a deep understanding of his own case. By the time he finished, even those who came to criticize him were quiet. He sat down slowly, closed his papers, and waited for the judge to speak. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that comes after something unexpected happens. No one clapped, no one moved. It was as if the entire courtroom was still processing what they had just witnessed. In that moment, it became clear to everyone that this was no longer about politics, no longer about sides or opinions. It was about a man standing alone before the system, using his own words to defend his truth. And that truth, whether accepted or not, had just echoed through the entire courtroom. When he finished, the judge leaned back slowly in her chair. For a few seconds, she said nothing. She just looked at him, the man who had just stood before the court and defended himself with such confidence. Then she finally spoke. "Mr. Kanu, I must say, I did not expect this level of presentation from you today." Her tone was not harsh, it carried a trace of surprise, even a little respect. Kanu simply nodded and said, "My lord, all I want is justice, not politics." Those words hung in the air. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the weight behind them. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't emotional, it was said calmly, but it landed heavily. The prosecutor tried to respond, saying something about procedure, but even he seemed less certain now. The judge told him to wait, still focused on Kanu. She asked, "Are you certain you want to continue representing yourself in the next sittings?" "Yes, my lord," he answered firmly. "I started this journey. I will finish it." That simple answer earned a quiet reaction from the gallery. Some people nodded silently, others exchanged looks of disbelief. It wasn't normal for someone facing such a serious case to speak like that, with no lawyer beside him, no one guiding his words. But he seemed ready for whatever came next. Outside the courtroom, security officers had already formed a tight circle, waiting for the session to end. But inside, it was still quiet, the kind of silence that only happens when everyone realizes they have just witnessed something unusual. The judge finally said, "Very well. The court acknowledges your decision. The next hearing will continue as scheduled. You may now step down." He gathered his papers neatly, stood up, and bowed slightly before the judge, a simple gesture of respect. As he turned to leave, several eyes followed him. Some saw courage, others saw risk. But everyone saw a man who had refused to be silent. As he walked out, reporters rushed to send updates. Within minutes, the news broke across social media: Nnamdi Kanu defends himself in court after firing all his lawyers. It spread fast. People across Nigeria and beyond began reacting. Some praised him for his boldness, saying it showed strength and intelligence. Others said it was a dangerous move, that no matter how smart he was, he needed legal experts beside him. But one thing was clear: nobody ignored it. Everyone was talking about it. By the time he stepped outside the courtroom, a small crowd had already gathered, held back by police. When they saw him, they started cheering softly, shouting his name. He didn't say much, just raised his hand once, then entered the waiting vehicle that drove him away under escort. That image spread online too: Nnamdi Kanu walking out of court, calm, confident, and unshaken. It became the photo of the day, symbolizing both defiance and hope for many of his supporters. Later that evening, several analysts began to speak on television and online spaces. Some said his move to represent himself was a form of protest against a system he no longer trusted. Others argued that it was a calculated act of strategy, a way to draw full public attention to the details of his case. Whichever side people took, one truth remained: the courtroom that day had witnessed something rare. Not just a legal argument, but a personal statement, one that would echo far beyond the walls of that court. Even those who disagreed with him admitted privately that his composure was impressive. There was no shouting, no anger, no drama, only quiet determination and a deep belief in his cause. In the following days, debates continued online. Some said his confidence came from deep preparation and faith in his convictions. Others feared that the government might respond strongly to his unexpected stand. But he remained silent, issuing no public statement. He let his actions speak for him. Weeks later, people were still replaying the clips from that day: the calm tone, the quiet authority, and that one unforgettable line, "I'll act as my own lawyer for now." It wasn't just a statement, it was a message. A message to those who thought he could be silenced. A message to the people watching from afar that he was still in control of his destiny. It was no longer just a legal case. It had become a story about courage, about standing up even when the odds seemed impossible. And as many Nigerians reflected on that moment, one thing became clear: whether you supported him or not, you could not deny his courage. That day in court changed the atmosphere around his trial. It wasn't about pity or politics anymore. It was about principle. And as he sat quietly that evening in his cell, surrounded by silence once again, there was only one thought running through his mind: the fight for justice had just entered a new chapter. And this time, he was ready to face it, alone, but unbroken.